Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Football Ancestry. This channel is kind of made for sports fans and history fans, and I'm just hoping to present the history of the teams, the sport, the coaches, presented in a way with like infographics and things like that. So if that's something that you think you're interested in, go ahead and watch this video and find out. I'll have more information about the channel and more information about me and things like that at the end, but I think we should just go ahead and jump right into this first episode. This first episode focuses on the Indianapolis Colts franchise and how they ended up in the city of Indianapolis. So our story begins in the year 1944 with a team in Boston named the Boston Yanks. This team would play in Fenway Park in 1944, play their football there, but in the year 1945, they would actually merge with the Brooklyn Tigers, another football team, and they did that because there was a shortage of players in the league due to World War II. So really our team is kind of this mixture of the Boston Yanks and the Brooklyn Tigers, and in that season they would finish 3-6-1 as their record. Following that season, now in 1946, the Brooklyn Tigers owner, Dan Topping, announced that he would be joining the recently established All-American Football Conference, meaning that he'd be leaving the NFL. And so obviously the NFL was not a fan of this, and in reaction, they revoked the Brooklyn Tigers from Topping, and all of its players were given to the Boston Yanks team. So now we're kind of back to just the Boston Yanks, but it's kind of expanded to include players from also that Brooklyn Tigers team that used to exist. But unfortunately, this Boston Yanks team continues to be not very good. This new influx of players didn't help them out. They suffered 3 more consecutive losing seasons. Following all that, the owner of the Yanks, Ted Collins, was finally granted permission to follow through on his desires to move the franchise to New York in 1949. He was hoping New York would be a bigger market, more publicity for his team where he could generate a little bit more cash. Speaking of cash, when Collins decided to move the team, he didn't just simply relocate the team. He asked the NFL if he could just kind of dissolve his current one and form a completely new franchise in New York instead of officially relocating. This was said to be done because Collins wanted to use it as a tax write-off. Not sure exactly how that all works out, but he just essentially just wanted to save money. So instead of moving the team, he decided to make a whole new one. But for the purposes of this, we'll just pretend this Boston Yanks team is just simply relocating. This new team in New York would be called the New York Bulldogs. They played one season in 1949, and they actually shared a field with the New York Giants. In 1950, Collins renamed this team to the New York Yanks and changed stadiums to the Yankee Stadium. But even following this 1 year, the 1949 Bulldogs to the 1950 New York Yanks, their roster almost completely changed. Only 4 players returned to that team from the 1949 Bulldogs. And they even imported like 18 new players from the New York Yankees football team that was in the new All-American Football Conference. They imported all those players from there, put them on this team. So really we're facing a whole new New York Yanks team as opposed to anything we've seen before. Unfortunately, even with this another new influx of players, this bumpy road and constant turnover of the Boston Yanks saga that we started with did eventually come to a close following the 1951 season, as the team was reportedly sold back to the league and the franchise revoked by the NFL. This was probably done from not winning games and therefore nobody showing up to watch the games. And so when money gets tight, they had to sell it back. So now that the New York Yanks team officially gone, this is where our story ends, right? Of course not. The 9 lives of the once Boston Yanks was brought back once again. Well, kinda. In January 1952, a Dallas-based group of millionaires led by brothers Giles and Connell Miller purchased the first ever Major League sports team in Texas, the Dallas Texans. And as a part of that new deal, they acquired the old roster of the New York Yanks. So in technicality, you could say that they brought back the Yanks and relocated them to Texas, which is what we're going to do for the purposes of this little history lesson. And this seems like smart business. I mean, they're going to Texas, which would surely be the perfect state for professional football, and there's really no competition in the state. Yet, this losing aura of this Yanks team still lingered, and this team would face dwindling fan attendance and continuous losses. On November 9th of 1952, the first year of the team, a game against the Los Angeles Rams would mark the last game the Texans would ever play in Texas. Reportedly unable to meet payroll and unable to get financial support from local businessmen, the Millers folded the team back to the league, still with 5 games left in the season. The NFL had moved the team's operations to Hershey, Pennsylvania, and even moved its last remaining home games out of Dallas, making them a kind of traveling team. Following this weird, crazy 1952 season, the NFL was unable to find an immediate interested buyer for the Dallas Texans, and therefore the team would be forced to relocate. So several months pass by. The NFL has failed to find a buyer for the corpse of what was once the Boston Yanks and Dallas Texans team. However, that's until a group of businessmen in Baltimore, led by Carroll Rosenblum, were granted a new franchise and awarded those remaining assets of the Dallas Texans, which included the roster of players. This team that was once the Texans, was once the Yanks, and then now the Texans, and then now we're going to say they relocated, air quotes, to Baltimore. This new Baltimore team would be called the Baltimore Colts. But this wasn't the first Colts team to ever exist in Baltimore. In fact, this current rendition of the Baltimore Colts got their name from a team that formed in a parallel timeline to the one that we're talking about right now. So let's go take a look at this separate timeline to see what I'm talking about. Enter the beforehand mentioned All-American Football Conference. This story goes back in time to 1946 when the AAFC, in desperate need of an eighth team to balance their schedule, granted Harvey Hester the first major sports team based in Miami, Florida, the Miami Seahawks. As you might have guessed by now, this team would not last very long, and by the end of their 1946 season, the team was $350,000 in debt, and the owner couldn't afford to repay it. As a result, Hester declared bankruptcy, and the AAFC commissioner, Jim Crowley, expedited the team in 1947. Following all of that Miami experience, the league approved a bid by Robert D. Rodenberg, along with 4 other businessmen, to reform that Miami Seahawks team into a new team, the Baltimore Colts. The name was chosen by the group to represent Baltimore's history of horse racing. So this Baltimore Colts team was put in a position to succeed by the league, as they were allowed to recruit a player from each of the AAFC's 4 strongest teams. And so with this team rooted in the history and culture of the city, and a hand-selected player from all the best teams in the league, there was no way fans would have no interest in this team, right? The Colts were literally the perfect team. Yeah, no, of course not. If you haven't guessed by now, starting a football team is kind of hard. And this Colts team, they made it through their 1947 season, but it was certainly not without financial struggle and a lack of kind of great interest. In fact, the whole league was struggling financially by 1948, and in an attempt to stay afloat, they merged with the NFL. 3 AAFC teams would be brought into the NFL. The Cleveland Browns and San Francisco 49ers were obvious choices. But the Baltimore Colts owner, he fought hard to get his team to be the third one. There were better teams in the AAFC, but the Colts owner really wanted his team to live on. Well, maybe he could make some more money joining the NFL. However, NFL's owner of the Washington Redskins, George Preston Marshall, initially fought this idea. He thought the Colts joining the NFL would be infringing on his team's territory. However, a nice $150,000 payment as retribution for the infringement guaranteed the Baltimore Colts a spot in the NFL over the next best choice, which was likely the AAFC's Bills. The Baltimore Colts had made it to the NFL finally and were ready to kick butt and reward their owner for the push he had made to get their team to continue its existence. Would this be where things finally turned around? No, of course not. The Colts went an astounding 1-11 in 1950. And the Colts owner, facing financial crisis, sold his team back to the NFL for $50,000, and thus the team officially folded. The Baltimore Colts franchise only lasted a short time in the NFL, but the fan support was surprisingly strong. And with that, the team's marching band and fan club stayed intact even after the team had folded. So maybe it was this lasting fan enthusiasm that prompted and supported Carroll Rosenblum, who we talked about earlier, to purchase the rights to the new Baltimore Colts in 1953. This would be the team that finally lasted. The Baltimore Colts would endure several more losing seasons, but in 1957, something happened that we haven't seen before. The Baltimore Colts had a winning record. They won more games than they lost. And in 1958, led by quarterback Johnny Unitas, the Colts went 9-3, and they reached the NFL championship game for the first time. The Colts would face the New York Giants, a team they previously had shared a stadium with long ago. And in that game, they went to overtime for the first time in league history. The Colts would go on to win this game 23-17. But it doesn't end there. This Colts team had a lot of failed franchises and a lot of losing to make up for. In 1959, this team went 9-3 again, and once again defeated the New York Giants in the NFL championship game. making them back-to-back champions of the NFL. Following a 4-year drought of championships, the Colts replaced their coach with a new one by the name of Don Shula. In Shula's second season with the Colts, he would go 12-2. He would ultimately lose to the Cleveland Browns in the championship game, though. Shula and Johnny Unitas would return to the championship game in 1968, however, and the Colts would win their third NFL championship. This started to foster a strong winning history and strong support for the team, and that team would continue to play in the city of Baltimore all the way up until the 1980s. But as we all know, this team doesn't last in Baltimore forever. The final home game of the Baltimore Colts would be played on December 18, 1983, in a game against the Houston Oilers. Colts owner Jim Irsay was adamant about wanting upgrades to his stadium, or even maybe a completely new stadium to be built in Baltimore. However, due to recent poor performances and stadium issues, the fan interest was falling and revenue was running out. Irsay publicly claimed he preferred his team stayed in Baltimore, but behind the scenes, he was having discussions with potential new cities. The frontrunners on those options were Phoenix, Arizona, and Indianapolis, Indiana. However, it was the recently completed Hoosier Dome, later the RCA Dome, designed specifically to host an NFL team that would push Indianapolis to the top of Irsay's list. Shortly after, a deal was finally reached with the city of Indianapolis to be the next host of the Colts. On March 29, 1984, a fleet of moving vans were sent to the team headquarters early in the morning, and by midday, the entire team's belongings were on their way to Indianapolis. In fact, the Baltimore Colts marching band had to move quickly to grab their equipment and uniforms before they were also shipped to Indianapolis. Kind of an indication that things were moving fast and maybe people weren't exactly aware of what was going on. This was quite a hurried move by Irsay. And obviously this did not sit well with the city of Baltimore, and it started a wave of legal action. Eventually, the city of Baltimore would reach a settlement with the Colts organization in March 1986, in which all lawsuits regarding the relocation were dismissed in return for the Colts to endorse a new franchise in Baltimore. And thus, this Indianapolis Colts franchise was born. A winding path full of failures and restarts that finally found stabilization in Baltimore before finally ending in Indianapolis. It took mergings of the NFL and the AAFC and the dedication of the people of Baltimore to not only form one Baltimore Colts team, but two separate teams finally get to be able to stick around and form a solid fan base and a solid football team. And the rest is kind of history. The Colts have found their home in Indianapolis. So I hope you were able to follow along and enjoy this trip through franchise history. I would greatly appreciate it if you could share this video with any other people you thought might enjoy football and history and enjoy this topic and future topics, and I invite you to subscribe to stay notified of future videos and just support my channel. I would also love if you could leave a comment with any feedback on the video itself, or maybe ideas, or if I even left out information, go ahead and let me know in the comments. So thank you, and I appreciate your view and I appreciate your support. See you guys next time.